You wake up one morning, and for a moment, there's silence. No buzzing notifications, no mental checklists, just a faint, hovering stillness. In that pause, something strange happens. You realize that your day, your so-called freedom, is already decided. The clothes you'll wear, the route you'll take, the choices you'll make. You feel a flicker of rebellion rise in your chest, a desire to break the pattern, to do something unpredictable. But the moment passes. You go on as usual. The illusion of choice remains intact, and you, the chooser, keep playing your part. It's a curious feeling to be free in theory, yet bound in practice. We celebrate freedom as the pinnacle of existence, the ultimate virtue of consciousness. Yet, when we look closely, freedom seems to carry invisible chains. Every decision liberates us from one thing only, to imprison us in another. The freedom to choose a path is also the burden of not choosing countless others. The freedom to love is the vulnerability to lose. The freedom to speak is the consequence of being misunderstood. Each liberty carves a new cell around us. Most of us never question this paradox because it feels too ordinary to notice. We live inside the quiet tyranny of our own autonomy, believing ourselves free simply because no one is visibly forcing our hand. But even without masters, we serve. We obey the subtle architectures of consequence, the kind we built ourselves. To be free is to be accountable to everything that follows. And perhaps that's why so many people avoid real freedom, because freedom, when stripped of its slogans and symbols, is terrifyingly heavy. Philosophers have wrestled with this contradiction for centuries. Jean-Paul Sartre called it the condemnation to be free. To exist as a conscious being aware of choice is to bear the unbearable weight of consequence. You can do anything, and therefore you are responsible for everything. Even doing nothing is a choice. Even avoidance is a declaration. Freedom is not escape. It is entanglement with every possible version of your life that you didn't live. Psychology agrees, though in gentler language. Studies in behavioral science show that the human brain, when faced with too many choices, experiences paralysis rather than liberation. The paradox of choice, as Barry Schwartz described it, reveals that the more freedom we have, the less satisfied we become. Every decision opens a corridor of regret, a mental simulation of what could have been. The same neural pathways that grant us agency also generate the ghosts of missed opportunities. Freedom, it turns out, multiplies our capacity for suffering. Even in the smallest moments, we feel it. You stand before a restaurant menu and feel a twinge of anxiety. You scroll through endless shows and feel strangely empty. You look at the vastness of your own potential life and freeze. Choice, once the symbol of power, becomes a quiet punishment. Each path implies 1,000 rejections. Each yes is haunted by the echoes of no, and beyond psychology, there is biology, a deeper pattern. Nature itself is bound by constraints. Electrons orbit their nuclei not because they lack freedom, but because freedom without structure collapses into chaos. A completely unbounded system doesn't expand, it disintegrates. Life, to persist, requires limits. The same is true of us. Absolute freedom is indistinguishable from nothingness. To be something, to exist in form, is to be defined by what you are not. This is the uncomfortable truth buried at the heart of freedom. Definition is restriction. The moment you choose a self, you deny infinite others. You narrow the field of being into one lived thread. You close the door on 1,000,000 possible worlds. You become accountable to the timeline you've created. In that sense, freedom is less about having no boundaries and more about choosing which boundaries you will inhabit consciously. But even that is deceptive because not all boundaries are visible. Culture, language, and memory are invisible architectures that predate our choices. They shape the very way we perceive options. You think you're choosing freely, but the frame of your choosing is inherited. The language you use to think in, the stories you believe about success, love, and worth, all predefine the range of motion your mind can take. You can swim as far as you want, but only within the pool you were given. Neuroscience paints an even bleaker picture. Some theories suggest that free will itself may be an illusion, a post hoc narrative the brain tells to maintain coherence. Experiments in the 1980s by Benjamin Libet and later replications showed that the brain registers decisions milliseconds before we consciously make them. Our feeling of choice may be a story, written after the fact, to make sense of impulses already set in motion. If that's true, then what we call freedom is simply the aesthetic of inevitability, the brain's way of decorating the cage. And yet, even if our choices are predetermined by biology, culture, or causality, the feeling of freedom persists. Perhaps it's because meaning requires the illusion of control. If everything were predetermined, morality would evaporate. Responsibility would lose its anchor. We need to believe that we are free, not because it's true, but because without it, everything collapses. The moral universe demands a narrator who could have acted otherwise. Still, this belief carries a cost. The more fiercely we cling to the idea of freedom, the more we resist the reality of consequence. We imagine freedom as flight, but it's actually weight. Every action creates ripples that exceed our control, political, emotional, and ecological. We buy something cheap, and somewhere a life is exploited. We speak a thought aloud, and someone carries its echo for years. We are constantly weaving chains from the threads of our own decisions, linking ourselves to unseen outcomes. The paradox becomes clear. To be free is to be bound by what freedom produces. A bird may fly wherever it wishes, but it is bound by the air itself. We too exist within invisible mediums, social, physical, and moral, that define the shape of our motion. Freedom is not a lack of limits, it's a negotiation with them. You can see this even in our pursuit of personal freedom. The desire to be free from often transforms into another form of captivity. The person who flees responsibility in pursuit of autonomy ends up enslaved to loneliness. The one who seeks pleasure without restraint finds dependence. The one who renounces attachment to avoid pain discovers emptiness as its own kind of pain. Every escape route loops back. The universe, it seems, is a closed system. Perhaps this is why true freedom often looks nothing like what we imagine. It is not rebellion, not chaos, not infinite choice, but awareness. Awareness of the chain itself. To know the walls of your cell so completely that they lose the power to define you. Freedom may not mean escaping consequence, but seeing through it. The sage in meditation, the artist lost in creation, the lover surrendering without demand, all experience a form of freedom that exists not in choice, but in the suspension of it, a kind of acceptance that erases the friction between decision and destiny. There's a quiet beauty in that idea. If every choice binds us, then perhaps freedom is not about avoiding bondage, but choosing the right chains, those made of meaning rather than fear. The vow, the calling, the promise, the devotion, each limits possibility, but deepens existence. The artist is bound by their craft, the parent by their child, the philosopher by their question. But these constraints don't suffocate, they give shape. We are creatures who crave both expansion and boundary, both autonomy and belonging. Our suffering begins when we mistake one for the other. We chase a mirage of infinite possibility and end up hollow, stretched thin across too many lives we'll never live. Yet in those rare moments when we surrender to one path fully, without regret for the others, we glimpse something close to peace. The paradox doesn't disappear, it simply becomes bearable. So perhaps the question isn't, how can I be free? But, what am I willing to be bound to? Because the only freedom worth having is the freedom to choose your own captivity, to know what you owe yourself, and to accept the invisible web that connects you to everything else. In the end, freedom is not a state we reach, but a pattern we recognize. It's the understanding that autonomy and consequence are two sides of the same coin. Every choice is a declaration and a surrender. Every act of will is a submission to its aftermath. You may wake tomorrow and feel that same quiet dread, the sense that your life is already charted, that every decision is another thread in a web too vast to escape. Don't fight it. Look closer. The web is not a prison, it's a pattern. And maybe freedom was never about cutting the strings, but learning to move with them. Because once you realize that, you see the paradox for what it truly is. Not a tragedy, but a law. The law that gives form to chaos, meaning to motion, and depth to being. You'll never be free from consequence, but in understanding that, you may finally become free within it.